Welcome to Truth Nation, ladies and gentlemen. A little side conversation going on there. We are about to start episode number 48. I am Bill Bodner, and I'm joined by the Chief, retired Chief Mark Garrett, 30 plus years, California Highway Patrol, the guru of all things California law enforcement, although he left the state. Chief, how are you?
I'm doing great, Bill. It's good to be back. It's been a little bit,
Yeah.
but as usual, a ton to talk about, but a great topic today.
We are going to talk about Mr. Ryan James Wedding, kind of known now, I guess, as the Olympic, I almost called him skateboarder, Olympic snowboarder who...
By the way, that shows our age. But anyway, go ahead.
The Olympic snowboarder who, according to Cash Patel, is a modern day Pablo Escobar or Chapo Guzman. And, you know, you and I will touch on that up front here. I kind of disagree with that assessment. And, you know, maybe let's start off with that, Mark. Well, Wedding turned himself in, negotiated his surrender this past week in Mexico, and he will be sent to the United States to stand trial. He's a Canadian citizen, was running this rather large drug organization for sure, and distributing cocaine in Canada, where there is a huge market, by the way. A lot of the cocaine that comes into California, I would say the number one market or the number one place that cocaine entering California goes to is Canada, believe it or not, which I find interesting because, you know, we are to Canada what Mexico is to us. The drugs that are issues in Canada are coming through the United States, going there. You know, that's a story for a whole different time. But I think first thing I want to bite off here, the first piece of this apple I want to bite, Mark, is just how they being the FBI. And by the way, it's an incredible case, and I'm not trying to say anything that would disparage the case or the agents that did this case. This is an incredible investigation, a complex investigation that they put together. But I do have an issue when law enforcement, and people may say, Mark, Bill, you're being hypocritical right now because you're doing a show about this guy. You know, well, now, Mark, I'm not the spokesman for DEA right now, and you're not the spokesman for California Highway Patrol. We're kind of true crime guys interested in this case that went on. What I have issue with, and I had issue with when I was at DEA, is how law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement, feels the necessity to kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Put these traffickers on a pedestal. Almost not what's the word, Mark?
Well,
make them bigger than life. They want to make them bigger than life. They want to make them super bad guys. And the reality is, I know why they do that. They do that because within law enforcement, Mark, if you did a car stop and you took 15 guns off the street, that's a pretty damn good car stop. You know, if there were 15 guns in the car. And what DEA had a history of doing and what the FBI has a history of doing is making the bad guys sound really bad because that gets attached to their self-worth, or then they are seen as better at what they do or more important to the community because they're catching those guys. And I guess glamorizing is the word I was struggling for. I really have an issue with federal law enforcement glamorizing these drug traffickers, in this case, especially since a lot of it is exaggerated and not accurate. And it's just done to kind of sensationalize it. And I think it really has a negative effect. And one story, Mark, I think I've told you this story before. I don't know, man, because I feel like I saw you at this event. And I don't know what you were doing in 2015, around 2015, what your assignment was, if you were chief in LA at that point.
And I was a captain at the time, yeah.
So were you ever involved in the security detail for AG Kamala Harris at that time? Did you ever do any?
Well, not directly. Okay. No, not directly. So that was a different unit. I was managing a protection detail, but that focused on the president and other heads of state, vice president, things like that. The AG is a separate detail. California AG is a separate detail run out of Sacramento generally.
Okay, so there was an investigation in LA, and it was called Operation Fashion Police, and it targeted money laundering through LA's garment district. And there was a press conference after it. And, a task force called LA Impact was very central to this investigation. It was DEA, HSI, FBI, et cetera, and this
CHP.
CHP and the state and
Mm-hmm.
local task force, right?
Yep.
And AG Kamala Harris spoke at it. And I thought I remembered seeing you at this event.
Well, did that event happen to be at Exposition Park by USC?
That could have been where the staging was. Yeah, likely that's where everyone staged.
It could have been. The guy was the
Yeah.
captain at that
Okay.
state facility at the time.
That would make sense because it would have been if it was sent. What was that LAP? Was that the CHP station under the 10 and the 110 at that?
So that's Central Los Angeles CHP. Exposition Park was a separate command.
Okay.
It was a new command that I took over. It could have been. And so
Yeah.
I was a lot of places, a lot of times in, so
Yeah.
we could have crossed paths. Yeah.
The reason I bring this up is there was a lot of money seized from one condominium in this case. And, it turned out to be like about $65 million in cash in bankers' boxes. That's a lot. That's the most cash that I've ever seen, heard law enforcement getting in one place, like outside of a, financial institution, whatever. And the press conference is about to start, and all the, agency heads are kind of making sure everyone's on the same page and going over what numbers they have. And a highly placed person at the United States Attorney's Office, who shall remain nameless, as these numbers were being bantered about, 65 million, well, it could be 70 million, maybe we should say 50 million. He blurted out $90 million. And we said, what's that? He said, we're going with $90 million. Okay, we went with $90 million, but it wasn't $90 million, but who's to say it wasn't $90 million? It sounds incredible, right? And I feel like a little bit with this Ryan Wedding case, that's what has happened. I found this quote the other day. This is from a guy named Matthew Hedger. I really don't know who he is. I just saw this come up on LinkedIn, and it was interesting because it kind of goes to the language that law enforcement uses to describe what's happening in the communities and their work in the communities, and how sometimes it just gets so sensationalized, it loses validity.
Yeah.
He says, the inflation of criminal language, when cartel and organized crime lose meaning. I spent years working on real transnational organized crime. Now when I search cartel, I see government scandals. And when I search organized crime, I get kids smashing mall windows. Words are losing meaning and precision matters. Words like cartel, organized crime, and mafia once had precise academic meanings. Today, they circulate freely across headlines, policy papers, and social media. The result is clarity of emotion, but confusion of definition. And I guess that's what I'm getting at here. Kash Patel, in a statement about Ryan Wedding, said that he was the modern day Pablo Escobar or Chapo Guzman. And, he's not even close to that, Mark. So when you see that characterization, like, why do you suppose they do that? Am I off base for saying that? And do you think, from your knowledge of the drug world, do you think that's accurate?
And listen, my limit, my knowledge of drug trafficking, drug cartels, not even compared to you, which is there's an astronomical, chasm between the level of knowledge, but even for the average person is limited because I didn't run in that law enforcement world. But as an observer, which is very important when we're talking about these types of statements, these comparisons, in other words, I think I'm pretty well read up on this stuff, and I think it's a poor comparison. And I want to say this, like you said earlier, Bill, I'm thrilled that this guy is behind bars. I'm thrilled that he's indicted. And this is a horrible criminal. And we'll talk about this. This is a bad guy. But this kind of reminds me, let me say this, why do they do it? I think there can be a number of reasons, different levels. One thing that I saw throughout my 30 years, and this goes with the California Highway Patrol or LAPD or, any other agencies I worked for or with over the years, often we find ourselves trying to really publicize what we did because we want to, for lack of a better phrase, justify our existence. See, you have to have us because of things like this. You have to give us more funding. You have to give us more personnel. And the general goal of those things, I think, is good. We want you to support us because we're trying to protect you. as members of a society. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that any of us in law enforcement sometimes can get overzealous about that, and we can certainly really embellish reality in an effort to seek public support, to seek resources. We have to be very careful, I think, laser focused on these types of things so we don't lose credibility in that attempt, that effort to do the right thing and to make sure that law enforcement is funded and supplied with the resources they need. So that's why I think these things happen. But there's a big danger, and I said about credibility. We see this a lot, not from law enforcement. We see it, in the public forum here, where either individuals or groups or certain law enforcement agencies are called Gestapo or called Nazis or things like this. Well, then the word loses its meaning when you start calling someone a Nazi because they made a mistake, as opposed to if they're actually specifically going out and hunting someone down to murder them because of their religion or because of their ethnicity. You lose your credibility. And the same thing can happen in law enforcement. It may not be a perfect comparison, but we have to be careful in law enforcement to call it as it is, to be very specific about, what we've done and what the person that we may have arrested is guilty of and responsible for, and what their impact on public safety is.
Yep. Well said, Chief. And I think, when we glamorize the criminal, it just doesn't serve us very well. I would rather see more of the law enforcement statements on these things focused on the victims rather than glamorizing the criminal and saying, hey, this is the biggest criminal ever, but we got him. Look how great we are. I don't like that. Just to put it simply, I don't like that. So now and by the way, he's a significant drug trafficker. I would put him in there somewhere with maybe someone who, from your old neighborhood, Mark, Freeway Rick Ross.
Yeah.
Freeway Ricky was this guy. If you're on the East Coast in Miami, Willie Falcone was this guy. And these are guys that have the ability. The number one thing you have to do in a drug trafficking organization, Mark, is you have to have someone that can turn that drug into cash. Someone that has access to the customer base. And Wedding had that through Canada. So he had a hungry customer base up there, which made him valuable to the supply chain, just like Freeway Ricky did and just like Willie Falcone did. When you can turn the drugs into cash, you're going to be very popular with the suppliers of the drugs. So where did this guy get his start? It looks to me like after the 2002 Olympics. And I don't know, Mark, when people may not remember this about you. We talked about it in one show. You were a competitive cycler on the U.S. national team. And Ryan Wedding, an Olympic level athlete on a snowboarder on the Canadian national team. It seems almost like when he got out of that, when that career ended for him, he was kind of thirsty to find that rush of competition or that, thrill-seeking behavior. When you stopped competitive cycling, did CHP fill that void? I know you competed while you were still at CHP, but was it your law enforcement career that kind of replaced some of that? Or can you see where someone that's competing at that high a level, when that's kind of gone from their life, they struggle to find something to get that adrenaline hit?
The short answer is no, Bill. And I'll tell you why. Now, again, is it possible? That's how they filled, their void. Listen, just to give a little background, your logic is solid. It makes a lot of sense. I got into cycling to fill the competitive void for football when I got cut by Jack Elway, John Elway's father at San Jose State. I didn't make the football team at San Jose State. I was incredibly hungry to compete athletically, and I took up cycling because some people, hey, you're good at this, blah, blah, blah. And then I had a great career, not because it was my favorite thing to do, but because I was good at it. It was an outlet. The reason I gave the short answer no is my experience, Bill, when it comes to athletics or, any type of competition is, and someone's behavior, like we see with Wedding here, he was way past his formative years in 2002. In other words, he was an adult. He had grown up. My guess is, it's only my guess, that if you dig real deep, he was probably involved in some nefarious activity while he was an athlete and even before, maybe. That's only my guess. I don't have any proof of that. I don't have any evidence of it. My point is, once you get to that age, you get to your 20s, your early 20s, things like this, you've kind of already formed a lot of who you're going to be for the rest of your life. And with principles, with activities, your distinction between right and wrong, your pathologies are already set. So my guess is that he was on this path and may have been involved in the type of behavior on a smaller level, before he got in there. May have before he, got into the high level drug trafficking. May this have been an outlet for him in competition, a way to express his, I don't know, his personality? It's possible. My guess is he was already there and he got exposed and had an opportunity to expand it, and off he went.
When his snowboarding career ended, he started working as a bouncer in different nightclubs in Western Canada, and soon involved in marijuana growing and marijuana trafficking. And back at this time, so this is, the Olympics he participated in was 2002. So, we're talking in the span of several years right after 2002. Man, I remember those years in Los Angeles. And the big thing then, we didn't have legal recreational use marijuana yet in California at that time. It was medical marijuana only. And the most popular black market marijuana was called BC Bud, British Columbia Bud, that would be brought down from Canada and sold in LA, and there was high demand for it. So he was involved in growing marijuana up in Canada. He was involved in getting it down to Los Angeles. And here's the beauty about what, these Canadian criminals and criminal groups would do back then. Let's say they had $1,000 of high grade BC Bud. They'd smuggle it down to LA, then they could sell it for $2,000 here. And then instead of taking that money back to Canada, they would use that $2,000 cash in LA to buy cocaine. And they would take that cocaine back to Canada and double their money again and sell it for $4,000. So they could make 4x on their money in the marijuana cocaine trade. And that's what he started doing. And I think the first time that he got arrested, when was that, Mark? Was it like 2009 or something like that? 2004?
Four, I believe.
Yeah, let me see. I got it. Yeah, it was 2008. So 2008. 2008. So he actually gets now, and this kind of goes to also the level of criminal he was in 2008. Mm-hmm. Nowhere near what he was, 2024, 2025, what we see right now. Because in 2008, he was engaging in this kind of scheme I just talked about and looking for a source for cocaine in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And who did he get connected with? Unfortunately, an FBI agent, right? So again, if you're falling victim to a sting where someone else, where the law enforcement is acting as the supplier of a drug it's called a reverse undercover operation. Law enforcement's acting as the drug supplier. If you don't have a source of supply for drugs and you end up, doing business with an FBI agent, trying to get drugs from an FBI agent, probably not a real high level guy, right? If you don't have those connections. And I think that's the reality of what he was then. But what is interesting is he went to trial, lost, convicted at trial. He got sentenced to 48 months in prison back then.
And by the way, my apologies. That's where the 4 years came from. A recollection served.
Yeah. Yeah. So got sentenced to 4 years, which is really, a pretty light sentence for attempted possession of 24 kilos of cocaine, which was what it was. I guess they did he had hooked up with an Iranian guy from Canada and one other guy, and they, traveled to LA. Like I said, they sold the marijuana, had the cash, were looking to buy cocaine, got caught up in this FBI sting. We used to humorously call these cases fundraisers, Mark. Fundraisers, because as you know, law enforcement seizes that money. They brought money to the drug dealer. They had money in the hotel room search. The money's seized and the money kind of goes through a court process and it becomes property of the U.S. government, which happened in this case, hence the term fundraiser. But so federal prison, you do 85%. Even if, even good behavior or whatever, you do 85%. So that ends up being about 41 months. And he got out
Mhm.
He was not out on bail, leading up to the trial, and he got out in December 2011.
And by the way,
And
Bill, if I can, please don't forget your
yep,
spot there. But it's
no,
something a
no,
little I found interesting about this because his co-conspirators in this case, when he was arrested in 2008, they all pled out.
yep,
He went to trial. He decided to go to trial. And I thought that was interesting. Obviously, if you have people around you involved, co-conspirators that go ahead and say, you know what, I'm going to roll over and take what I can get here, take a deal. And you decided to fight this, knowing, by the way, the conviction rate of federal charges, when you get federally indicted, I think it's like 93% or something like that.
yep.
So this goes to your point a little bit about, his personality, about being aggressive, so being confident, and off we went. But anyway, that's just a personal thing I found very interesting.
It's super interesting. And also, it's also how he was characterized, how his behavior was characterized at that trial. Just
Right.
sitting there, no real emotion, no expression, calm, no big deal. Got convicted, didn't cooperate, didn't give anyone else up, and just did his time.
Mhm.
My question, which I don't have the answer to, and I know you don't either, Mark, but is that federal prison stint, 41 months or whatever he did, how beneficial was that to his later criminal life? Did he
Yeah.
make the connections in there? Because he was in prison in Texas, in federal prison in Texas, where, a lot of the people there were charged with cross-border crimes, whether it's drug trafficking, human smuggling, et cetera, et cetera. And, did that stint in federal prison kind of allow him to make connections that he relied on later on to become a much more savvy and larger person in the drug world? So here's how he's eventually then gets out and starts kind of establishing this cocaine empire, so to speak. I don't know, Mark, we really don't know a lot about him between when he got out in 2011 and then when he was first charged in 2024, right? June of 24, that first indictment, right? Is there anything that you saw?
No, I'm so glad you brought it up because I thought maybe I didn't do enough research. And that indictment, it kind of starts. It certainly does mention the prior conviction, this current indictment, but I could not make a time connection either. There's a gap there, and so I'm glad you brought that up, Bill.
Yeah, and even some of the language in the indictment, generally what you'll see in an indictment when they describe a criminal organization is like from a date unknown. They'll say from a date unknown to the grand jury until today or whatever, this organization was trafficking in drugs. Well, in this one, they kind of set the date at when he got out of jail. I saw some of the charging documents, like said, since it's December 2011. So they're intimating that as soon as he got out of jail, he was kind of back in business and back involved in drug trafficking. So he's charged in 24, and then another indictment in 24 where the charges are kind of beefed up, and then really a third indictment in 25, and that's, I guess, the one more to focus on, Mark. They're all significant, but that one really is kind of has the best glimpse into what he was involved in. Obviously, there's specific drug amounts listed in the indictment, and it's multi-hundred kilogram amounts of cocaine, 200 kilos, 300 kilos, etc. I don't know if I saw this in the actual indictment or if it's something from another news story that Cash Patel or someone said, but they mentioned that they could attribute 6 metric tons of cocaine smuggling to him and his organization. And I found that interesting because, again, they compared him to Pablo Escobar and Chapo Guzman. And man, we just had Mike Chavarria on talking about his
I was
book,
just
Junior,
writing notes about Mike.
son of
Yeah.
And that guy did 47 tons of cocaine in a couple year period. 47 tons, and who even knew his name?
Right.
Nobody knew his name. So
I remember he was just I won't use the word small, but he was only a piece of the much larger puzzle of these other guys we're talking about.
That's it. And when they talk about Wedding having this international organization, I don't want to say it's not accurate, but what he had is customers in Mexico. I'm sorry, he had customers in Canada, and then he had access to all these brokers in Mexico that could do all the things that he needed done, for a fee, kind of like what Junior was doing in that book. Like Ryan Wedding wasn't arranging the transportation of the drugs from Colombia, through Central America into Mexico and all that stuff. But there were people that were doing that on a daily basis, and he could just tap into them because he had the connections in Mexico. How did he have the connections in Mexico? Because he had access to this great customer base that make him an extremely popular person because of dollar signs, right? If he can sell your cocaine, you're going to make a lot of money. You're going to give him access to your connections. So here's how the government characterized his organization. The Wedding Criminal Enterprise, a $1 billion drug trafficking organization. Now, again, $1 billion street value, like if you're selling grams on the street or what, that's the question. The largest supplier of cocaine to Canada, operated in Mexico, Colombia, Canada, and the United States, among other countries. They source the cocaine from Colombia, working and testing it in cocaine kitchens run collaboratively with a Colombian neo-paramilitary group and drug cartel. So in Colombia, there's like the FARC, there's, I don't know if Aguilas Negras is still there. There's all these either right-wing or left-wing military groups that make their money from the cocaine trade. And, is Wedding working directly with them? No, he's not working directly with them. But again, he's working with people that know people that are getting the cocaine from them.
And Bill, keep an eye on your notes. I want you to keep your thought on it. There's to go along with that. In other words, the reality is it's obligatory to be involved with all. If you are in this business at any level, there is no way around working with these paramilitary forces, these corrupt law enforcement agencies, corrupt government officials, all the traffickers, brokers. That's what you have to do. So it's certainly not extraordinary in the context of this game, this criminal game.
100% correct. And every cocaine dealer, arguably in the United States, has some connection eventually to those groups, because they're the ones running the labs. They're the ones in the jungle running the labs. And when Junior was taken, remembering again the Junior case, remember he did take a trip into one of those labs at one point, and there were guerrillas nearby. The Colombian military was moving in, and they had to get out. They had to get him out of there, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, that's just part of the business. Like, that's how the business is done. The Wedding Criminal Enterprise, working in conjunction with members and associates of prominent Mexican drug cartels, utilized boats and planes to move hundreds of kilograms of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico and, then into the United States. While we're on the subject, Mark, when you hear boats, right? Hey, a lot of stuff in the news lately about boats in that part of the world being blown up with drugs on them. And so much of there's a lot of like misinformation or misperception that people have, where they think the U.S. government is making the argument that these boats are coming right into Florida, or that these boats are going from Venezuela into the United States somewhere. And that's not the way the routes work. The cocaine is generally going by land from Colombia into Venezuela, by boat out of Venezuela up the coast through Central America, and they're going to rendezvous with other boats or go ashore somewhere in Central America, offload the cocaine there, and then ship it by truck the remaining distance up into Mexico, and then eventually smuggled across the U.S. border. So when you hear about boats in that part of the world, don't think like they're, going into Florida or North Carolina or something. That's not the way the supply chain works. But 100% that cocaine is headed to the United States. Know that. Or it's going into Panama, and it's going on a container, and it's going to Europe or something like that, of course. But yeah, that's just by the nature of the business, right? It's not like he had a specific one-on-one relationship with someone who was doing that just for him. It's these people that do that for a living, and they're going to move coke for everyone. Mark, had you ever heard of this charge, continuing criminal enterprise, operating a continuing criminal enterprise?
You know what? I'm glad you brought that up, Bill. I have heard that, and of course, and really in relation to Rico is where I've heard
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what came to mind when I kept seeing that in the indictment.
A great analogy, because really that's kind of what it is. It's like the RICO for a drug case. And
Mhm.
I'm going to be honest, Mark, it's rarely used. It's like, I want to say it's a minimum mandatory life sentence for if you're convicted of operating a continuing criminal enterprise. It's a very significant charge. I may be wrong about that. And if you say, man, how could a DEA guy not know this? It's because it's used so infrequently. And here's the reason why, because a
Right.
lot of times, especially in a city like LA, the drug quantities are so big that you can get to the same ballpark sentence without charging a continuing criminal enterprise. And there's a lot less you have to prove to do that. So it's an easier
Yes.
case when you
Makes
don't
sense.
charge that. And if the drug quantity is significant, you're going to get the same amount of jail time on the person. So it's like, why is a prosecutor going to go through all that? They generally don't do it. But when you see that charge, it should open your eyes like, okay, this is a very significant charge. Why was it used in this case? And the reason why is, I think, because of the murders that these people were involved in, this organization was involved in. And did you kind of, Mark, this indictment was written a little bit, I don't want to say confusing, but it's very technical, and there's a lot of like abbreviations used and stuff. And the person was thought they were reaching out to this person, but in reality they were talking to an informant, and that can get kind of confusing. Did you make enough sense of it there to understand like the basic premise of what these guys were doing, how the organization worked?
Oh, certainly. I mean,
Oh,
it laid it out. Yeah, I had a good idea. And by the way, again, we opened up saying, hey, this is really in our respective views. This is not, Chapo Guzman, this is not Escobar. But having said that, it was quite intricate. It was
hmm,
quite complex what was going on here and a lot of moving parts. But yeah, going back to the indictment, oh my good, there's tons of repetition. And
yeah,
I learned after about 20 minutes, like, okay, I can stop reading the first 6 paragraphs on this one because to go on
right.
all the AKAs and on to skip through. But having said that, when you're talking about the confidential sources, I think it is important. It did get a little confusing because I had to go back and reread a number of times. Was this the same CS or was this a different one? I had to go back and read a couple of times to figure out. And some of the confidential sources were specifically to this charge. They were building a case on this charge as opposed to another CS building a case on this charge. And of course, some of them overlapped. So it was a
Hmm.
little bit confusing, but I guess under the circumstances, it's what you expect.
Yeah, and here's what they were doing in essence. And it's, hey, this is bread and butter for people in Los Angeles because, as I say, Canada is such a market for cocaine that this is a pretty common scheme. So the Mexican drug trafficking organizations will cross the cocaine over the border from Mexico into the United States, and they will deliver it. They're responsible for getting it up to Los Angeles. And, people may think, well, geez, why Los Angeles? Like, why not San Diego? That's the first big city you encounter. Why are they bringing it all the way up to LA? Because there's checkpoints there. And I can't remember where
Mm-hmm.
exactly on the 5 freeway, for example. There's
Well, San
immigration check.
Onofre is
San Onofre, that's
San
it,
Onofre.
San
Yeah,
Onofre, which is
there's
north of San Diego, right? So
yes,
there's
there's a
all these.
second one on the 15. But I'm
Yep.
sorry, not to interrupt you, but
No,
go ahead.
that's perfect. So these
Mm-hmm.
two checkpoints that Mark mentioned, they are north of San Diego. So the deal is you got to get the cocaine delivered somewhere north of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they bring it up to Los Angeles and they would turn it over to another Mexican organization responsible for warehousing it in the LA area.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually that cocaine is turned over to the Canadian representatives in the LA area. And they're going to hold on to it for a while. And you can see that's where law enforcement targeted the transactions. Like they had that informant in there. And as they were passing numbers back and forth, phone numbers to make contact with each other, this informant could work himself instead of this informant just passing the numbers back and forth, he was actually having the conversations. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it appeared to me. And
Yes,
he would have the
yes.
conversations, set up the where this transaction would take place, and law enforcement would swoop in and seize the drugs or follow the drugs away, etc. So anyway, so the Mexican warehouse people in LA, they have the drugs. They turn it over to the Canadian organization representative in LA, and then he holds on to it till the truck drivers get there. He then turns it over to the truck drivers. They put it on a 18-wheeler and drive it up, into Canada, either via Detroit or Washington, etc. And that's kind of the general idea of what these people were doing every week, every month, over and over. A few hundred kilos at a time. That's a pretty good sized load. And they're doubling their money, each time they do it.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think of the way that the kind of security method they used to make sure they were dealing with the right person? Did you catch that? Where they would have a serial number from a dollar bill?
Zero for
Interesting,
dollar.
right?
That's what I was writing down there.
Yep.
I thought it was interesting. It was the first time I ever heard of that specific, use of codes. And I know I spoke right over you, but what they were doing, they were getting a particular serial number off of a dollar bill, and that was the code that would pass on to the operatives. And so, including these, confidential sources. And so this is how they knew that the information that they were disseminating was accurate. That would be the code word, for, so to speak. But I thought that was fascinating, and they used that for a long time. They didn't change their method. That was that dollar bill serial number was for a long time. Matter of fact, I think throughout the entire time that I read the indictment, that's what they used. I don't remember seeing any other method of verification. And it's interesting, Bill, you're talking about, Los Angeles area here with that. There's two things. The general geographic area they were using, of course, was about, hour and a half, 2 hours east of Los Angeles in the Inland Empire. We're talking about Riverside, San Bernardino areas. And I think one of the reasons is because they're a lot less populated, a lot more rural, and you have industrial areas out there and things like that. Probably easier to secrete some of the actions out there. The other part I found very interesting, it's kind of timely, I think, Bill, even though this was happening years ago, but also in California with the commercial trucking. Obviously, we've seen about, licenses and legal immigrants that are driving commercial vehicles, certainly outside of federal law and even outside of some of the own state laws in California. California is violating their own laws by giving them licenses. But I wonder how much that played into this. Obviously, California geographically is kind of direct conduit up to the west coast of Canada. But at the same time, I wonder if that made it easier, maybe some type of maybe lax regulations or enforcement, things like this, because it's a big deal transporting a couple 100 kilos of cocaine from Southern California all the way through California, through Oregon, through Washington, which is another state that's come under fire about lack of enforcement and regulation on review of some of these commercial, not just drivers, but enterprises, entities. So that kind of struck me, a little bit of a side note, but I'm not sure it's unrelated.
Yeah, I don't think it is and what's interesting, Mark, is, and so at this time too, I was a first line supervisor in DEA in LA from 2002 to 2006. And then I came, transferred out and came back in 2009, and I was a second line supervisor up until 2017 or something. So I was kind of knee deep in this particular type of smuggling scheme, which was common. Canadian traffickers involved in stuff like this was very common. It was always East Indian trucking companies or East Indian truck drivers. And I don't know, Mark.
You said it, not me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just the reality of what it is. And the indictment, as soon as I saw the names in the indictment, I said, oh, this guy was a truck driver. And I read the indictment, and guess what? He was a truck driver. So a question for you, I don't know if you would know this, it's kind of a little in the weeds, but because of NAFTA, do you know the rules for commercial licenses, like a Canadian commercial driver's license? Obviously, he doesn't, if they're coming down from Canada, I don't think they're licensed in the United States, but is there some reciprocity or something? Like they get an international
driver's
license?
No, they're not. So I can tell you this. Yeah, so the NAFTA thing's above my head as it relates to, specific rules and regulations with the commercial enforcement. A lot of people think because I was a chief of the Highway Patrol that you should know this back and forth. Well, look, it's like being a pediatrician or you're an oncologist or you're a brain surgeon, just because you're an MD. It's a very specialized part of law enforcement in general, and specifically the CHP. The Highway Patrol is the cutting edge when it comes to commercial enforcement. However, those guys and gals, they undergo a tremendous amount of specialized training when it comes into commercial regulation and law enforcement. But I will say this, that even during some of the fires, which was ridiculous a year ago, and we were
Hmm.
getting help from, I say we, California was getting some assistance from Oregon and Washington. I know there were some rumors that even some of those fire and law enforcement personnel that were coming in to help their vehicles were being inspected to make sure that they comply with California regulation. I think that is a rumor. I think that was overblown. I think that there was some obviously waiving to get those resources in. But here's my point. The point is those safeguards do exist. So when you have vehicles coming into California, from Mexico, from Oregon, from Washington, wherever it is, that they do get inspected. They're supposed to be. Now, what's actually been happening? Look, I don't know for sure. I have my suspicions,
Hmm.
but they're supposed to have those parameters in place in order to make sure that these commercial vehicles coming in meet California safety regulations. So having said that, how easy was it for to get these vehicles in and out of Canada, into California and out of California? I don't know, but there's a lot of suspicion there.
Yeah, there's a pretty significant truck stop on off the 60 freeway at Milliken. What is that? City of Ontario,
Yes,
California. And
correct.
man, I can't tell you how many DEA cases end up at that truck stop at 3 o'clock in the morning when someone's dropping off, 200 kilos to a truck driver. Very popular smuggling method, especially for the most popular smuggling method to get drugs into Canada is a commercial tractor trailer. So one other thing I
It's
found in the
amazing.
indictment what's that, Mark?
No, it's amazing.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too long winded, but I just find it fascinating that you know people can be so successful in this mode of transportation, because we all
Yep.
think about, oh, you got drug dogs, you got probable cause, or you get a warrant because it's part of an investigation. But you know what, when you're throwing a ton of mud against the wall, you only need a few ounces of stick in this line of business, to make money. So
Yeah, and look at the volume, right? Just the volume, and I don't mean drugs. I mean the volume of
that's
trucks in a city like
that's what
LA
I
with
mean. In other
yeah,
words, something's gonna.
right, the
Yeah.
port of Long Beach, the port of Los Angeles,
Hmm.
the tons and tons of cargo that comes in here and gets trucked out to all over North America, just piggybacking a couple hundred kilos on that, man, that's not that hard to do. And yeah, you can see where that becomes pretty successful, even if it doesn't work all the time.
Hmm. Right.
Anthony, maybe you can help us with this. They were very specific type of cell phone called a Graphene OS cellular phone. Just because Mark and I, approaching our 60s, probably aren't the best people to talk about current technology.
Yeah. By the way, I approached my 63 years ago, Bill. But anyway, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah. Okay, so it has no Google trackers. Yeah, it has no firewall, you say, or a strict firewall. That makes more sense, right? So
Hmm.
here's the kind of differences that are highlighted there. It's de-Googled, enhanced privacy, robust security, precise control, strict firewall, longer support, clean slate, high resilience. Basically, it's a hardened, de-Googled Android phone. Yeah, I think that kind of explains it. A hardened, de-Googled Android phone, higher security. Oh, Mark, you and I have done a lot about
Hmm.
the kind of background apps that
Hmm.
track what you're doing on cellular phones. And this is a
Hmm.
phone that would, has a different operating system that would thwart that or prevent that. And I guess
Hmm. Yeah.
Canadian organizations were always kind of on top of the latest in technology. Whether it was Blackberries with encrypted email back in the day or just anything that was kind of like cutting edge technology,
Hmm.
Canadian organizations were always on top of it. I don't know what
Which is
else,
news
Mark.
to
Should
me,
we
by
go
the way.
through a little bit of what each person was alleged to have done, or what do you think?
Well, I think one of the things, Bill, and you hit on this a few minutes ago, and that's really about the capital crimes
Mm-hmm.
that he is alleged to have committed, have orchestrated. And I think of anything that might be the best comparison that law enforcement can make between him and say a Chapo Guzman, the best,
Right.
not the only, but so I find that very interesting. I find it very revealing about him as a human being. And so I would like to get into that, but whatever else you think is important that the audience should know, 100%.
No, go ahead. So take it away.
Well, I mean, just for one example, I don't have the indictment in front of me, so this is from
Hmm.
memory, but I know that there was one example where there were, I think you talked about this earlier, where sometimes instead of cash in exchange for product, sometimes people are paid back with product so they can
Hmm.
go out and sell it and make a profit rather than giving them cash directly. And sometimes people are actually, in other words, so the distributors can sell a certain amount of product and then loan, say on consignment, give them more
Hmm.
and expect payment later. And this happened with one of Wedding's contacts or distributors that I believe it was 2 or was it 4 kilos that he was given without having to pay for it up front.
Hmm.
And he was delinquent on getting that product sold and reimbursing Wedding. And I believe Clark is Wedding's co-conspirator from memory, I believe.
Yep. Yep.
And they were a little bit irritated, and they sent a message to this guy, this trafficker, saying, listen, if you don't pay us back or get us the product back by X amount of time, we're going to kill your mother.
Hmm. Yep. I remember that
And
one.
based on, yeah, and again, I apologize, it's a little bit sketchy because I'm doing this from memory here, but this to me, I listen. I obviously it's happened. Obviously, there's no redeeming quality when it comes to these drug traffickers. But even that, I mean, that alone really tells me the depravity of this man because it seems to me, and you can tell me, better than I'm aware of, I'm sure that going after someone's mother in this kind of arena doesn't seem to be the first level of
Right.
payback
Right.
normally. We're
Right.
going to get you, we're going to get your brother maybe, but for one's mom, that one really stuck out to me, Bill.
Yeah.
And
That's a
then
great
this
point
goes
because
go ahead, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, no, I was going to say, like, when you hear about traditional organized crime cases, you hear like families are off limits,
Right.
and this was when they went straight to the mother card. We're going to kill your mother.
Yeah, there was nothing like, hey, you're going to die. You're going to die. And then we're gonna get your best friend or we're gonna get your uncle, whatever. It went right to the mom.
Right. Yeah,
So I
ruthless.
stepped on it, but I stepped on you. But go ahead.
No, that's a great example of it. I mean, something else that they did along those lines, Mark, is they had a guy who ran this like his name was BAL. He ran this like urban underground
Mm-hmm.
news. I don't want to call it a newspaper, but it was like a blog or a online news forum or whatever. And they would pay him to almost like post threats or, for
Well, what they
instance,
did
go ahead.
again, it's amazing with my mind. I remember this one really clearly. What they were doing is because these were people that they were looking for. Their
Hmm.
rivals, the people they perceived to be rivals, or they thought might be cooperating with law enforcement. And so they paid him two things. Paid him for two things. One of them was to actually post pictures of these people that they were trying to track down and kill, that they, for whatever reason, that he would publicize their photo. He would put them out there in the public's view. So people would talk about them, maybe reveal where they were, unknowingly that these people were subjects or targets of the cartels, these traffickers. And they also paid him, which I thought was funny. If I remember correctly, it was like only 10 grand or something they paid this guy
Yep.
not to publicize negative things about him, Wedding and Clark and other associates. So it was a two thing. Hey, help us find the people we want to kill and don't
Yep.
say bad things about us.
Yep. So here's specifically what it says in the indictment, Mark. It says defendant Bal, a Canadian citizen and resident, and the founder and operator of The Dirty News, was a member
Yes.
and associate of the Wedding Criminal Enterprise. In exchange for payment, Bal agreed not to post about defendant Wedding and Clark and posted a photograph of victim A so that victim A could be located and killed. And
Mm-hmm.
victim A was somebody who they thought stole a drug load from them. I think it was a pretty
Correct.
significant one. And
Mm-hmm.
they were trying to track him down. And this person kind of put a picture of him out and said, "Hey, who knows this guy? He's about to rat on the biggest criminal organization in Mexico," or something to that effect. I don't remember what it was,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, weird. Like you don't
And
set
by the way,
in.
unfortunately for that guy, it worked because they
It
tracked
did.
him down at that restaurant. And
Yeah, that's an interesting. So they, and then that goes to again, Wedding, because of Wedding's ability to turn cocaine into money, he had these connections in Mexico, and he had these connections, thanks to those people in Mexico, he had these connections with people in Colombia. And also maybe he was in prison with people from Colombia. I don't know, man. Still, I'm not clear exactly on that. But they were actually to track a guy down to a restaurant in Medellin, and they used a prostitution ring, a woman from a prostitution ring, to find him. And it was a typical kind of South American execution. Guy on motorcycle rides up, into the restaurant, 4 shots in the head, and he's out. And they had a photographer there, 5 shots to the head, Mark says.
Yeah.
And so they have a guy, 2 guys. I don't know if they were riding double on a motorcycle or 2 motorcycles, I forget. But they do the execution, and they also have another guy with a camera there, and he takes pictures of it. And these pictures get posted on the dirty news to show what happens to someone when they try to cross or rip off the wedding organization. It's a pretty chilling message, when you see this guy shot 5 times in the head at a restaurant in a foreign country, and you're like, shit, I better not mess with these guys. And that was a big part about what they were doing. You know what's interesting, Mark, is there were 3 indictments in this case, right? Mm-hmm. The first 2 indictments mentioned this guy Clark, they mention him as a target or as a defendant, Wedding's right-hand man, etc. He gets arrested in 2024, October 2024, and the last indictment, the superseding indictment that's filed on October 28th of 25, all of a sudden his name's in lower print. It's not capitalized. He's not a target anymore. And, when I read that, I was like, well, he's already in custody, but that doesn't really mean a lot because the government always supersedes and files additional charges to people in custody. And then you start looking at the detail in that final indictment from October 25, which wasn't in the previous indictments, about the murder for hire schemes, et cetera, et cetera. And you wonder, man, did he cooperate? Like, is he now someone that's cooperating with the government and providing all this insight, which has enabled them to get this much detailed information about the different roles people had in these assassinations, etc.? Possible. I don't know. I don't know if he cooperated or not, but I'll say it's very strange that all of a sudden he's not a defendant in the final indictment. He's named in it, but he's not named as a defendant. There's no additional charges on him. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
Yeah. I know there's one other thing I think I wanted to talk about. Oh, the other murder. So, Mark, do you remember the murder of the 2 people who were renting a house and they were actually innocent of anything, really had nothing to do with anything? I think they were referred to in the indictment as victims B, C, and D.
Right. Yeah.
So let me see. I got the defendant Wedding. And I want to be clear about this. So defendant Wedding, and Wedding is in capital letters in this indictment. He's charged with this thing that I'm about to describe. So defendant Wedding and Clark's not in capital letters, and he's not actually being charged with this. Defendant Wedding and Clark would issue an order to kill CC1. I think that's cooperating witness 1 or whatever, and believing that CC1 had stolen approximately 200 kilograms of cocaine from them. They would enlist the services of a Canadian-based assassin crew to do this murder. The members of the conspiracy would break into a house that victims B, C, and D were renting and kill victims B and C and cause victim D serious bodily injury. So what happened was they thought that this house was where this person's family lived, but it was not. That the family was renting the house out to these people that were completely unrelated to it, and 2 people completely unrelated to this criminal network that had nothing to do with drug trafficking ended up getting killed, and their daughter shot and really injured pretty bad. And man, I saw an interview that the daughter did describing what happened. Ooh, chilling,
Yeah.
Really, really chilling. So that's horrible type of retaliation that they would undertake. One kind of final thing I want to go over, Mark, is the Canadian lawyer. His name was Pardekar, I think, Paradkar.
Yes.
I call him a lawyer. I don't know. Technically, in Canadian terms, I think he's a barrister.
Right.
but they would use him to get information about criminal cases that their organization members were wrapped up in.
Hmm.
Find out if they're
Yep.
cooperating, find out how much information they'd given up. And even in one situation, he tells them, hey, if this one witness wasn't there, that this whole previous indictment, if this one witness was gone, this previous indictment, they couldn't charge you with this, right? Without this witness. And maybe it's the person who
I think was it the indictment or was the extradition? Because I believe that was the one Medellin, the restaurant we're talking about.
I mean, it's probably that guy.
Specifically, that was the extradition issue.
Yeah. Whatever it was, that case was going to go away if they could,
Right.
if this guy wasn't available. And then they start talking about killing him, and the lawyer's like, hey, don't have the conversation about you killing these people. And I'm paraphrasing here. Don't have the conversation about you killing these people with me on this text thread. And they were using Thema or something called Threema. What was it called?
Threema. I never heard of it before.
I've never heard of that either. They were using this thing called Threema for secure message texting. And, don't have it with me on here and delete these messages when you're done. But basically he was, in my opinion, telling them that, hey, if you killed this guy, you're scot-free on this old case.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that too much either. Like that's, is dirty. There's some sketchy lawyers around LA and around the United States. And hey, it happens where they get wrapped up in these criminal cases and become part of the organization. But really, that was it. That's dirty. Like when you get into,
well, it reminds me of You Better Call Saul. That's exactly what, he's part of the criminal organization. That's all there is to it.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know, Mark. That's really it. Where we're left is, I don't want to go through all the different seizures, but, multiple seizures of a couple 100 kilos each. That's what he's charged with. How he came to be in custody. Again, I think it's interesting that they got a lot more detail in this indictment, this final indictment from 2025. Clark is not charged in this indictment. And a lot of the details are things that Clark was involved in, which leads me to believe that it's possible he's trying to work out a deal and providing information. I don't know, but that's what it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
But at first, the word kind of was that Wedding was captured in Mexico. And now I think a little more realistic is that he turned himself in, right?
Yeah.
I think he turned himself in. It was a negotiated. He turned himself in. It was a negotiated surrender. He'll be coming up here to the Central District of California, where he'll make an appearance. Who knows what terms he negotiated, right? But likely he's getting something, for turning himself in. What do you think of him turning himself in? Is that, Mark, you and I don't want to go off on another tangent here, but you and I have often spoke of our belief, and even Mike Chavarria, again, kind of backed us up on this, about how the United States government negotiates with the Mexican government, and how a strong negotiating hand is going to lead to much better results than this policy of appeasement. Is it possible in this case that's what we have here, where, the United States government is basically just at whatever level told them, hey, you're going to give this guy up and that's how it's going to be, or there's going to be repercussions, the type of which you've kind of seen from current news events around the world right now? Do you think that plays a hand in this? Why now all of a sudden, I guess, is what I'm asking, when this guy's been on the run for several years?
Well, I think the question why now it's an important one. There's part of this is what I find interesting. How often I watched the news conference, the press conference a couple of days ago, right? And who did we see there? We saw the FBI. We saw, by the way, the FBI director, Kash Patel, was at the press conference. Then the FBI, I believe he was sacked there, LA field office probably.
Yep.
Then we saw the LAPD police chief.
Mm-hmm.
Then we saw a Canadian official.
Yep. RCMP.
At the press conference. How often do you see this level in these various entities here, working together? And apparently, again, Mexico, because this guy gave himself up. So your question is, why now? It's a very good question. I think maybe from a political point of view, why now? I say political, in other words, from an administration's priorities, why now? I think it's kind of clear that the current president, current administration is taking some very clear, very decisive, very overt, very powerful acts to stem the flow of illegal drugs into California. Whether people like the tactics or not, it is happening. So, however, going back to this, and again, I keep repeating what you said, why now? Because is Ryan Wedding, is he the biggest fish in the pond right now in this world of drug trafficking? My guess is no.
Correct.
That's my guess. He's not the biggest one out there. So why him and why now? It's a very interesting question. I don't have the answer for it. I will say this. It's possible because he was low-hanging fruit, that he was an easy one to negotiate for. Maybe he didn't have the political clout that some of these other organizations do with the Mexican government. Hey, don't mess with us and we won't mess with you. But maybe he doesn't have that clout. That this administration was able to negotiate for him. And it can be, hey, here's a win we have with, drug enforcement. So it could be a political win-win for both sides. I don't know, Bill, but it is fascinating. It really is. There's usually something behind the story that we don't know about. It's usually the case. But, it is what it is. They got a bad guy off the street, and I'm glad about it. But
yeah, me as well. And here's what I think, Mark. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there when, in essence, you said he's not one of them. He's not a Mexican national, Mexican citizen.
Right.
He's a Canadian citizen wanted by the United States and Canada. So, hey, why not? And what else is interesting, Mark, and man, the Mexican government has a history of doing this so often, like not just once or twice, but so often. Whenever there's a high-level visit of maybe like Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State, not Treasury. Secretary of State's going to Mexico. The Vice President's going to Mexico. The President's going to Mexico. Or in this case, I don't know if you know this, Kash Patel going to Mexico.
Yep.
All of a sudden, they put something together, and it makes the U.S. look good. It makes them look good, and it's on to the next thing. So Kash Patel was in Mexico when this happened. And I would say that has something to do with it, because the Mexican government says, hey, this guy's here. We're going to throw him a bone. Here's someone who's not a Mexican citizen that we can give up. And hey, he's paying people off. Who cares? He's not one of us. He's going. And I think that's what happened. I think that's what
I agree.
happened. And
I think that's a much more concise assessment to my meandering.
Yeah. And I think, a couple of weeks ago, we saw this press release that they seized, what was it, 62 motorcycles belonging to him. Did you see that, Mark? Let me see if I can find it. It was
motorcycles and the vehicles, or other cars as well, I believe.
Yeah, 62 high-end motorcycles.
The thing is, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'm just reading 62 high-end motorcycles, many of which were rare Ducati MotoGP race bikes. The collection is estimated to be worth approximately $40 million. I don't know. That might be a little bit of a high number, because those are vehicles that you can't register on the street, and the collection, the market for
Bill,
them.
It's like artwork. You can kind of make it.
Right.
Yeah, you can make it.
Right. Again, somebody like my friend at the U.S. Attorney's Office back in 2015 said $40 million, and that's it. It was $40 million. You know what I mean? They don't even know what they had. But what were you gonna end with there, Mark?
I was just going to say, part of this indictment, it's certainly not unusual, but what I found maybe a little unusual, it was really heavy on the forfeiture, the seizure aspect, I thought, at the end of one. Maybe in your experience, it wasn't that heavy. It seemed like it was loaded pretty heavy to explain all the things that he was going to forfeit and the government was going to seize as a result of, of potential convictions. So.
Yeah, interesting point, and that's a good point, because part of proving a CCE case, a couple parts to what you just said there, Mark. There's three things I think that they have to prove in a CCE. One is that there's 5 or more members of an organization. In this case, I think they do that. The second is that they profit substantially, that they derived some really significant financial benefit from this organization. And the third thing is that the person they're charging is let's call him a leader, manager, supervisor of the organization. And I think they kind of laid that out. So I think the forfeiture allegation kind of gives credence to the fact that they were making a boatload of money by doing this. And also the other side to that forfeiture thing is, hey, forfeiture now is a little, it's not, how it used to be. Like, I think people take a harder look at forfeiture, drug-related asset forfeiture now than they used to. And that's people on both sides of the aisle, right? The people on the left say that we shouldn't be taking these people's property without due process, because oftentimes the asset, as you know, Mark, the asset is taken first, and the probable cause is, although it should be present to take an asset, the probable cause is not kind of explained till later. So taking someone's property without due process is not necessarily as easy to do as it once was. And then on the other side of the aisle, on the right, the Department of Justice or the executive branch controls all this money. The lawmakers, the senators, the House, they have no control over this money. When, like, all the assets seized in this case are going to go to the Department of Justice, and they're going to use that. Pam Bondi's going to use that as her, quote, slush fund to fund law enforcement operations around the country. So that's also something that lawmakers don't necessarily like. They want to have their control of the purse strings. So the way to kind of push back against that negative connotations of asset forfeiture now are to charge it as a criminal thing. Put it in the indictment, charge that property as if it's a person, and then there's no question down the road that there's probable cause ahead of time. A judge or a grand jury in this case has said, oh yeah, there's all these assets that the government identified. The government has the right to take them. We're making a probable cause finding. We agree with the government that all that is criminal property. Just kind of makes it a little cleaner to take it later, and there's less argument, less ability to argue. And I would think that probably part of
That's a great explanation, Bill. That's a great explanation.
Yeah, and I would also think that probably, especially with the seizure of motorcycles a couple of weeks ago, I think the agreement for him to turn himself in was probably made at that time, and he started turning over assets, and they decided to actually just wait to do the dog and pony show until Kash Patel came down there to Mexico so he could be present in Mexico when it happened. An interesting case, Mark. Hey, if people...
It is.
Yeah, and I don't know, there'll probably be... So let me just say real quick what this reminds me of. And Mark, maybe it's a case that we should talk about Freeway Rick Ross sometime, or the other group in Miami, which is really most closely resembles this one because of their use of murder of witnesses and intimidation of witnesses. I mean, it really mirrors this case closely. And I think there's a documentary about it called Cocaine Cowboys on Netflix. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime.
Yes.
It was a criminal case that took, close to 12 or 13 years to get through the court system because of, I mean, it's got jury tampering, Mark. It's got murder. It's got everything. So maybe we'll look at that one in the future. Or another one this reminded me of was a USC football player named, I think his name was Owen. Let me see. I'm going to have to look that up real quick before we sign off here. He was known as the cocaine quarterback, even though he didn't play quarterback. Let me see if I can pull his name back up real quick. Owen something. He lived in, and he was from Redondo Beach, Mark, which, as you know, that's where I live. Owen Hansen was his name. Owen Hansen is a guy that was an outstanding volleyball player in South Bay of Los Angeles, where I live. Scholarship to USC to play volleyball. The strength coach sees him, and I don't know, he's 6'6" or something, big guy. The strength coach sees him in the weight room sometime and says, hey, have you ever thought about playing football? And he says, no, I've never even played high school football. And the strength coach tells him, come out for the team. So he goes out for the team, Mark, never having played a down of organized football in his life. He's the only walk-on to make the team, makes the USC football team as, I think, a wide receiver or tight end, something where his height and his jumping ability is going to come into play. And, man, what happens after that is, because this is back in 2002, 2003, 2004, like the Reggie Bush, Matt Leinart days at USC, then he goes down this life of crime and becomes also an international drug dealer. And it's a fascinating story. So maybe we'll take a look at a couple of them. But That's all for this one. Let's see. He's going to appear. Wedding's going to appear in court in L.A. We'll see what happens. I suspect eventually he wouldn't have turned himself in. I don't think if he was going to go to trial again, he might have learned from his first exposure that maybe just try to get the best deal he can. And if he can take the CCE off the table and maybe get a deal around 20 years, that's probably about the best he can hope for. What do you think? Any other closing thoughts, Mark?
No, other than it's a fascinating case, and there are a lot of questions there, which that's why it's fascinating. So it was an opportunity for me to learn about the demand for cocaine in Canada. This is news to me.
Yep.
I'm glad you educated me and our audience as well, Bill. But no, it's a great topic.
And our law enforcement guys out there, please don't glamorize the crooks. They don't have to be the biggest thing, since sliced bread. It just makes people fall in love with, I think it makes more people fall in love with the criminal element and really kind of draws people to the criminal side and the lure of big money and everything else when law enforcement start to glamorizing it. So talk about the dark side, talk about the victims, focus your press releases on who these people killed and the treachery, that the families that they ruined, the innocent victims that were just renting a house that were murdered in front of their daughter. That's who these people really are, not jet-setting millionaires. So that's it for today, Mark. Thank you for joining me. The story of Ryan Wedding in the books. We'll see where it goes from here. Take care.